I was looking through the rubric for the On the Media assignment, and I realized that I have not created a video that talks about context. I don't know what I was thinking. But this is pretty imperative, really, to understand just about every class that I teach, anything having to do with communication, but especially in studying social media and what's going on there. So I use context in your assignment for the On the Media post or discussion you're going to get into. To have you kind of learn that, kind of flesh that out. So I'm going to go through and give you an example on the show that just happened this last week. There, with Brooke Gladstone, Bob Garfield was off for the week. That way, the show was called Apocalypse Now, and it gets into a number of stories about the whole impending concept of climate change and what that means, and how we go through and digest that. They get into some fictional accounts and talk to a couple of authors and such. So this is not a bad way to go through and maybe introduce you to the communication notion of context. Context really is where meaning takes place. Without context, we don't have meaning. And that's why this is important for you to understand as you go through and synthesize these programs on the media, on the show on the media. If you apply context to them, it helps you get a better grasp of meaning of what's going on. Okay, so there are, for all intents and purposes, about 5 different contexts we're going to be talking about that I want you to address: physical, psychological, social, cultural, and temporal. And if you've taken other classes from me, you already know this speech. I'm hoping that you have some idea of what I mean when we talk about context. You've heard the expression, or maybe you've been taken out of context, that something that you said or somebody else said was taken out of that context and now has a new meaning because the context is no longer applied to that. Okay, well, that's kind of a definition of context, but there are a number of different types of context that give us a better understanding, a better meaning in terms of what it is that we're trying to express or communicate that way. And it's important then for you as a student to understand how you can apply that towards the stories that you'll be listening to on the media. So let's get into the first one. It's pretty simple. The physical context. The physical context is where the story is happening. It's where communication takes place. And of course, the physical context for climate change is here. It's planet Earth, and we have all kinds of places on Earth where we see a manifestation or evidence of climate change happening that way. I won't get into that debate, but you see it here as it comes up. Okay, so the physical context is where communication takes place. So, for example, if on the media we're doing a story about refugees coming out of Syria, what would the physical context of that be? Well, it would probably be Aleppo or whatever town it was that's where that story is taking place, okay? So the physical context is where that story, where that communication is taking place. Next is the psychological context, and this has to do with how we feel, what we're thinking. And most communication happens to affect some kind of psychological context. I really love the show in terms where Brooke talks about just what does it mean to be apocalyptic, and she gets into things like nuclear holocaust and zombies and plague and all kinds of things that way. And each one of those can bring up within ourselves a psychological response, especially if we happen to be big fans of zombie apocalyptic types of shows. We almost become enthusiastic about that, which is interesting because some people are bracing for climate change with that in mind, as if it's another Walking Dead kind of thing, and folks are prepping for. There's a whole prepping community out there. Well, that's a psychological context. Does it create fear? Do we end up denying? There's a whole host of climate change deniers that are out there who deny the science. There are people out there who discount the science, science in general, in fact. There are new groups of people starting to believe that the Earth is not round, that it is indeed flat, and, well, I won't get into that. But that's a psychological context, okay? It's what's going on in your brain in terms of how we are responding to emotionally, okay, to the story, to the communication that's going on. Next is the social context, and this one is interesting. It divides into 2 parts. The social contexts are the roles that we play, okay? So Brooke Gladstone she plays a certain role. She's a mediator. on the media. Okay, she's mediating about the media. She's kind of what would we call it? She's a meta mediator. Sorry, I just crack myself up sometimes. Okay, but within the social context, that's the role that she's playing. And you and me are listeners. Okay, we're listeners within that exchange of information that's going back and forth. But she also has guests. She has. I listened to the first half of the show. There's a couple of authors that come on there that talk about how they envision climate change and what's going on and the characters that they develop. Well, all those are social roles there, okay? The second part to the social context are the rules that we have all kind of agreed on in terms of how we're getting along socially. So there's certain social mores that we obey, okay? Like lying, for example, is a social more. It's something that we would rather didn't take place, even though it happens all the time. So the social context within this deals with the people, and it deals within the rules, all right? In terms of climate change, the social context might go back to the deniers in terms of that psychological context. Note, none of these contexts are mutually exclusive, okay? They all bleed into each other in order to create some kind of meaning. In fact, we need at least 3 of these in order for us to get a better understanding of what's going on. So the social context in terms of the rules, psychologically, we might be breaking some of those rules. That's why I put up this slide. I don't believe in global warming with the water level climbing up. Well, there's a rule being broken there, okay? Besides the social context is the cultural context. And this one's pretty funky. It goes back to our beliefs, our values, our attitudes, our mores. We live in a country where that voted in a president based on the culture of coal. And the culture of coal is counterintuitive to the whole concept, or culture, if you will, of climate change. Okay, there is a clash that is happening there between those contexts involved in us coming to understanding of what climate change is going to do. The culture of coal goes back to a very deeply rooted American tenet of hard work, of pulling energy out of the ground and being able to turn that into something. And even here in Utah, in Price, in Emery County, that culture still exists, and it's very counterintuitive to the concept that climate change even exists. And the reason why is because the reason why climate change is happening is because of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases come from burning of certain types of combustibles, carbon-based type things like, well, the most carbon-based type thing that's out there is coal. So there's where we get into a contextual conflict in terms of culture and what's going on there. The last one is this idea of the temporal context. And this has to do with the passage of time. Now, we can look at this in a number of different ways. If we're talking about climate change and context, the temporal context, it's been forecast that eventually, because of the rising sea levels, that our borders will change, and they'll change over time. And so that becomes a temporal context. You can see here along the western and the eastern seaboard and along the Gulf area too, areas of the United States that are going to disappear according to the projections of computer models and the rising water level of the world's oceans. So that was pretty quick here, but it's something that you need to understand. So maybe not a bad idea to go back and watch this a time or two, take some notes, maybe do a little research in terms of context and what that means, okay, and how we derive meaning, physical, social, or psychological, social, cultural, and temporal. I'm looking for your application of these contextual ideas in your on-the-media analysis of whatever story you decide to pick, okay? It's number 1 on that rubric. Okay, any questions? Let me know. You know where to find me.